Shema koleinu, Hashem Elokeinu, Chus v'rachim aleinu. 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 V'kabel berachmin u'veratzon, kabel berachmin u'veratzon, kabel berachmin u'veratzon, et tfiloteinu. Shema koleinu, Hashem Elokeinu, Chus v'rachim aleinu. Shema koleinu, Hashem Elokeinu, Chus v'rachim aleinu. V'kabel berachmin u'veratzon, kabel berachmin u'veratzon, kabel berachmin u'veratzon, et tfiloteinu. Oh yeah, da 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 da. Oh yeah, da 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 da. Oh yeah, da Shalom Aleichem, dearest friends. Thank you for being with us. So happy that we got off to a very strong start, very powerful start in our series of the Rebbes you may never heard of. And we began learning the life of the great tzaddik Shlomo Radziner, Hashem Yikom Damo. And today we have a tzaddik to delve into whose face kind of says it all and is something that I'm sure that once our eyes lock in with his eyes, it won't leave us. Personally speaking, I have a little bit of an extra kesher to him. His first name was Shlomo, and he was a Kohen. So today we're going to be learning about the story of the life of the great Gvir, the great tzaddik, Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen Rabinowitz of Radomsk, the last Radomsk Rebbe. Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen Rabinowitz of Radomsk. And there's a lot that we can say about him because we actually have a lot of information about him. But we're going to try to stay very focused and go shlav by shlav over here. But first, I want us to just take in his face for a second. Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen Rabinowitz of Radomsk, the last Radomsk Rebbe. And take in those eyes, those precious eyes. So, who was Reb Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen? This Radomsk Rebbe that we're speaking of was born in 1882, and his Abba was the previous Radomsk Rebbe, Rabbi Cheskel Radomsker, known mainly for his Sefer Knesses Yecheskel, which you'll see in front of you, which was a Sefer on the holidays, the calendar of the year. And this Knesset Yecheskel was the grandson of the first Radomsk Rebbe, the Tiferet Shlomo. So this Reb Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen of Radomsk became a Rebbe at the age of 29. He became a Rebbe at the age of 29, and the pictures that we have are a little bit later in his life, but at 29 is when his Abba died. Now this Radomsk Rebbe was very, very unique. Of course, every Rebbe has their own story, and every Rebbe has their own uniqueness, and some of the Hasidim always say that each Rebbe had a certain mitzvah that they were most kashur to, they were most connected to. This Radomsk Rebbe, we're going to see a lot of very interesting things. But first of all, the Radomsk had thousands and thousands of Hasidim throughout Poland and throughout Galicia. And the word was that back then in pre-war Krakow, which was like, a huge headquarters of Hasidus, there were more Radomsker Shtiblach in the city of Krakow than there were of Hasidei Gur, of Ger Hasidim, which was also already big back then. And again, when we think of the war, and we kind of put things into perspective, if there were so many thousands and thousands of Radomsker Hasidim, have you met a Radomsker Hasid today? Do you know where the Radomsker Beis Medrash is today? It's because, again, like many of the dynasties, Radomsk took a massive, massive, massive hit. And this Rebbe was very, very talented. And what he was able to do was that he set up a network of yeshivas, and it was called Keter Torah, Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. And this network had 36 different yeshivas, which mounted up to approximately 40,000 Bachrim, 40,000 Talmidim. And each yeshiva had its own Rosh Yeshiva. And what's interesting is that, and we'll get to this a little bit later, that the Rebbe's son-in-law was a very interesting figure. His name was Reb David Moshe Hakohen Rabinowitz. The Rebbe's son-in-law was like the Rosh Yeshiva of all the Rosh Yeshivas. And it was a flow of learning, a fire of learning, and it spread, like we see, throughout the whole area. And another very interesting thing about this tzaddik that you're looking at was that he was also a merchant, and not just a businessman, an extremely, extremely successful businessman. In fact, he was a multimillionaire. And one of the very interesting things about him is that he'd make partnerships with many of his Hasidim. And some of the tales are that the Hasidim that the Rebbe made a partnership with, they're the ones that became successful and were also saved during the war. But besides the partnerships that the Rebbe had with his Hasidim, is that he also had private affairs too. He had private businesses. He owned properties in Berlin, in Leipzig. This is all obviously before the war. And Hasidim knew, it was pretty clear to them that the Rebbe used approximately half of his fortune, half of his wealth, to go to these network of 36 different yeshivas. I mean, those of you that are involved in the fundraising world, those of you that are involved in schools, in shuls, in yeshivas, you know how difficult it is to keep up one of these institutions. Imagine back then, 36 of them. Well, one of the reasons that they were able to uphold so many is because the Rebbe himself financed it. So if he's a multimillionaire, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that are going into all these yeshivas. The Rebbe also had the second largest library of Sfarim throughout Poland. I think the one who had even a larger library was the Ger Rebbe. So that was also a very interesting thing about him. Now, based on what we're describing, it would seem to paint a picture that doesn't really seem to fit a Rebbe. You know, Rebbes, we know from a lot of different stories, they're more either poor or completely poor. or like a little shtetl, little stiebel. This is a completely different picture. But the opposite of gaiva, or whatever you want to call it, was the truth. Because even though everyone knew of his wealth, everyone felt closer to him, and everyone felt very loved by him. It was an amazing amount of love that existed between the Rebbe and his hundreds, if not thousands, of Hasidim that he was close to. So the Rebbe, the Radomsker, he lives in the town called Sosnovtza, I think it was called, before the war. That's where thousands of his Hasidim were living. And thousands of his Hasidim would come flocking to him on Shabbos and Yom Tov before the war as well. His tishim were, like the way he led his Hasidic court was mamish, like malchus, which was very much in line with the whole energy and experience of the Radomsk dynasty, starting by the Tiferet Shlomo, his great-great-grandfather. By Radomsk, there was a concept of mamish tiferes, which doesn't just mean beauty, but it means like regal beauty. So it's like malchus. It's like, holding your heads up high, singing a gevalt, and leading tishes with divrei Torah that would truly, truly make everyone feel that they were receiving a dose of life. That was his style. And the Rebbe published a few things in his life. His son-in-law also published some of his Torahs. But when the war came, it caught, like many people, it caught the Rebbe in a not at home. When World War II broke out in Elul in the summer of 1939, the Rebbe was actually vacationing with his family in the Carpathian Mountains, and this was not a place that the Rebbe was so used to being, but he was there when this broke out. And from there, the Rebbe had fled to Lodz. And on Hanukkah 1939, just a few months later, he was sent to the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, in the ghetto, the Rebbe ends up spending time in what's called the Schultz factory. The Schultz factory was a very famous factory where, this is a picture of it that you see in front of you. The Schultz factory was a shoe factory that was set up in the Warsaw Ghetto. The head of the factory, I don't remember his name right now, but he was able to get some of the most prominent Rebbes that were thrown into the Warsaw Ghetto, get him a gig in the Warsaw Ghetto. And by manufacturing shoes, kiviyachol. And there are many stories about this, but one of the people that also worked there in this Schultz factory is none other than the Piasetzner Rebbe, Zchus Yagen Aleinu, the Esh Kodesh. In fact, there's a lot of lines here, there's a lot of keshes here between Reb Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen and the Piasetzner Rebbe. In the document you have in front of you, you'll see right now a kol koreh. A kol koreh is always like a leading cry out, a calling to people, to Yidden, to help. To help for what? Well, in this document, which was signed by the Radomsk Rebbe, this is a kol koreh to aid the yeshiva that was called Das Moshe. What was Das Moshe? That was the Piasetzner Rebbe's yeshiva that had about 300 students before the war. And that they had a very beautiful kesher, and Reb Shlomo Chanoch Radomsker would spend time with the Rebbe, in this factory, in the Schultz factory, and while they were, so to speak, working on shoes, they were really repeating Gemaras to each other. They were saying Tehillim to each other. They were repeating Ma'amari Chasidus that they had remembered. That's what was going on in this Schultz factory. There's a lot of documentation coming out of there. Other Rebbeim were there as well. I believe the Chenchiner was there, and I think the Ger Rebbe was there as well. I don't remember right now. But the Chenchiner was there, and others were there as well. And this is how he begins his time being in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, before we continue in the ghetto, I want to go back a little bit to give us a little bit of a picture, to understand the psychology as much as we can behind a Hasidic Rebbe who was used to a certain life and meeting the Ribono Shel Olam in that kind of life, and then going back to the other world. In pictures that we're going to show you right now, we have a number of pictures of the Rebbe, which this is pre-war, and one of them you see over here with his Hasidim. This picture really, really, really took me. You see that the Rebbe is second to left in the front row, with a little boy in front of him, and a young, it seems like a young teenager to his right side. This is the Rebbe and his Hasidim traveling somewhere. I'm not sure where it is, but you get a sense of Malchus. This picture also, this picture of the Rebbe smiling. This is what his life was. And if he's born in 1882 and the war is 1840, so we see it, he's around the age of 60 when things are really starting to, just the hell's breaking loose. This is the Rebbe. And I think this is a very important thing that we have to do while we're learning about their lives and hearing their stories, is to realize that although things were never perfect or beautiful, when the Rebbe had a certain Simchas Chaim, the Hasidim had a Simchas Chaim. When the Rebbe was shining and glowing, the Hasidim were shining and glowing. And here we see this picture with this smile and these shining eyes, these smiling eyes, only to know that the next few months after this picture probably, here we are, and we're going into the Warsaw Ghetto. It puts things into perspective. So I want you to continue now and take a look at the picture that's in front of you while I share with you the following story. The Rebbe spent 3 years in the Warsaw Ghetto. And for those 3 years, he was living in horrendous conditions. Hashem Yirachim. He also suffered from diabetes. And yet with all the pain that he went through and a completely different life, there was no money, there was nothing. And money, what would money do anyway for a Jew in those times? And yet, despite all of that, the Rebbe does not refrain from leading tishes throughout that whole time. He continues somehow in ways that we can only imagine. The Rebbe continues leading tishes throughout that whole time. But here comes Tisha B'Av 1942. Everyone knows that Tisha B'Av 1942 was a very, very, very distinguished Tisha B'Av because on that day, mass deportations began to take place in the ghetto, which were sending Yiddilach off to Treblinka. And from Tisha B'Av, every few days, the Germans, Yamach Shimon, would gather up a bunch of Yidden, send them up on the trains, and just send them to be slaughtered. So, about 10 days after Tisha B'Av, 9 days after Tisha B'Av, word got out to the house where the Radomsk was staying that he was going to be deported. And it was going to be on Shabbos, the 18th of Av, 9 days after Tisha B'Av. So the Radomsk Rebbe took his family and himself, and they went to go hide by the Piasetzner, by the Eish Kodesh. They went in hiding by the home of Reb Plonimus Kalman Shapira, who he was very close to. And they slept there that night. And on Shabbos morning, they were under the assumption that the Germans came, took whoever they wanted, and coast was clear and they can go back to their home. So he bids farewell to the Piasetzner, to the Eish Kodesh. They return back to their house. But to their shock and horror, just a few hours later, at about 3:30 p.m., the Germans came back and they arrived at the house and they told the Radomsk, come with us. And the Radomsk knew exactly where they were heading. And my testimony said that the Rebbe was stroking his beard over and over and over again. And this picture that you see in front of you is the street on where this scene took place. This was called Nova. It was a very interesting last name. I think it was called Noplinsky Street. Mashukazin Noplinsky Street. And this is, oh yeah, you have in front of you Novolipia Street. This is the Germans setting this street on fire. It could be that in one of these buildings is where the Radomsk was, I don't know. But this is a picture on that street where this took place. And of course that the Radomsk did not agree to go with the Germans. He didn't agree to go with them. So while he's stroking a beard over and over again, they took out a weapon and he was murdered on the spot together with his wife, their only daughter, and together with his son-in-law, Reb Moshe David, whose face also is very striking, which you'll see in front of you right now. Reb Moshe David Hakohen Rabinowitz, I want to speak about him for a second. He was murdered together with his father-in-law, with his wife, with his mother-in-law. He was married to the only daughter of the Radomsk Rebbe. And if you listen to his name sounds very, very familiar. His name is almost the same thing. He's Hakohen Rabinowitz. He is a cousin of the Radomsk Rebbe. They married, they were married back then into the Mishpacha. I think he's a second cousin of the Radomsk Rebbe. Now he was born in 1906, so he was killed, he was murdered, 36 years old. And his father was a big tzaddik. He was a big Rebbe of a town called Krimelov. And already from a young age, this tzaddik, Reb Moshe David, he was a giant. He was an Ilui. And it's interesting about him is that he was also pretty different. He didn't learn in any yeshivas or with a specific Rebbe. He just had it, and he learned on his own. Now, he ends up marrying a woman named Reisel. Reisel was the only daughter of the Radomsker. And when they got married, they also moved to Sosnovitz. And in 1926, when the Radomsker set up this whole network of Keser Torah, of the 36 yeshivas, it was really Reb David Moshe who led it. He led the whole operation. And he, together with his family, was sent to the ghetto. And it's known that in the ghetto, he continued being a Magid Shir Kavua, a permanent Magid Shir, one who would give Shir all the time to a select group of 5 Radziner Hasidim that were with him, located in the same area in the Warsaw Ghetto. Interestingly enough, just another beautiful connection here that we have to the Eish Kodesh. This tzaddik, Reb David Moshe, Moshe David has a lot of siblings. And they all married Rabbeim, or they married into rabbinic lineages. He had a sister, Chaya Sarah. Chaya Sarah, his sister, was the wife of Rabbi Shaya Shapira, the Admor Chalutz, the brother of the Eish Kodesh. So there was a family connection here as well. Remember, his sister, Chaya Sarah, she had made it to Eretz Yisrael. She was saved. They had lived in Eretz Yisrael. But he's the brother-in-law of the Eish Kodesh's brother. So his brother-in-law's brother was the Eish Kodesh. Now, due to the amazing, amazing chesed of the son of the Balabayit of that house in Warsaw Ghetto, we see something very unique that takes place to the body of the Radomsk Rebbe, which was really, really rare back then. Somehow, the son of the Balabayit in the house in which the Rebbe was murdered, he was able to bring the Rebbe and his family into Kvuras Yisrael to have a proper burial in the Jewish cemetery of Warsaw. So some people may get confused because they see his kever in the Warsaw cemetery, and most people that are in that cemetery are Yidden that were killed before the war. But he is from the rare kever that had it's like an unfortunate privilege. It's unfortunate because Alavai, he could have been alive, Chai V'Kayim, the rest of his life. But if he did, if he was murdered, to be brought to Kever Yisrael was a very, very big thing back then. Remember, we were learning in the first class about the Radziner Rebbe, the Shlomo Radziner, how he spent time by himself digging a huge mass grave, burying all these yidlach that he was able to salvage from being thrown into God knows what. So the fact that he was brought to Kvuras Yisrael is a tiny, tiny bissel shtickle nechama. So as we go back to looking at the Rebbe's face and seeing this light, this malchus that we have. So I find it right to just give ourselves a bracha, to strengthen ourselves very much, that we should ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all the shefa, both in Ruchnius and in Gashmius, that we could show the Ribbon Shleilim, you can trust us. If you bless us with a multitude of wealth, we will know how to use it in the right way. And we'll set up networks and chains of learning, of davening, of experiences, of being together b'simcha, just like our tzaddik, Reb Shlomo, Chanoch, Hakohen, Radomsk did as well. So I want to sing a nigun in his memory. And sing with me, please, if you can. Vani b'chazdecha, b'chazdecha b'tachti, vani b'chazdecha, b'chazdecha b'tachti. Yagel, yagel libi, b'yishuasecha. Yagel, yagel libi, b'yishuasecha. בחסדך פתחתי, ואני בחסדך פתחתי. לה 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 One day soon we'll see the smile. We'll see that smile again of this precious tzaddik. We'll see those shining eyes again of Reb Shlomo Chanoch Hakohen. We'll all rejoice together in the Yeshua, the salvation with the Geula Shlema B'Hamitis B'Mhera B'Yameinu. Amen. Tehei Nishmasa Tzrura B'Tzror HaChaim.